Hey Archaeofiends, Paul Edward here. Welcome back to the channel. Recently, an article that was published back in October of 2022 started popping up again on social media. Niche nerd social media, of course, but this article, it comes from a BBC travel series called Rediscovering America, which describes itself as telling the inspiring stories of forgotten, overlooked, or misunderstood aspects of the U.S., flipping the script on familiar history, cultures, and communities. And there are some really interesting articles that cover a bunch of topics, like one on Phyllis Wheatley, the first enslaved person and first African-American woman to write a book of poetry in the colonies that would become the United States. But it's this one that I'd like to talk about. Mysterious Viking runes found in a landlocked U.S. state. And below that headline and the massive picture of the stone, we get this lead. Did Vikings find their way to a remote part of Oklahoma? Some in a small community believe so, thanks to controversial runic carvings found in the area. This small community is Heavener in LaFleur County in southeast Oklahoma, which was home to 3,051 people in 2021. According to the data analysis company Qubit, in 2021, households in Heavener had a median income of $39,248, while 37.5% of families in Heavener were living below the poverty line. And like many places, Heavener's been trying to encourage tourists to visit, to help build and diversify its economy. Oklahoma isn't exactly one of those places that top tourist lists for going to the United States. Somebody doesn't think about going to the U.S. and go, oh, let's go to New York, California, Florida, Oklahoma. Sure, there are some people out there somewhere dreaming of going there while annoying their friends with Rodgers and Hammerstein songs. No, not that one. I'm talking, of course, about The Sound of Music. The one with the spinning in the mountains, the songs about how to sing, the naval officer from the great maritime power of Austria, and a brave but ill-fated amphibious assault on Bratislava. I don't actually really know what it's about. I've never seen it. Tourism in Oklahoma has grown since a study on hotel stays was carried out in 2014 that ranked it 41st out of 50. And despite the state's growth, it can't really be compared to, say, Texas, its southern neighbor that ranked 4th in that same study and currently has a tourist spend that's 10 times greater than Oklahoma. In fact, according to the U.S. Travel Association, Oklahoma had a lower travel spend in 2022 than each of the 6 states that it shares a border with. In 2021, the Oklahoma Tourism and Recreation Department began a rebranding project for the state using the tagline, "Imagine that." And that year, according to the OTRD, tourism brought in 17 million visitors, generated $10.1 billion to the state's economy, and $748 million in state and local tax revenue. Now, according to the U.S. Travel Association, travel spending for that year was $6.9 billion. The OTRD calculated that travel spending increased by 3.2% from 2019 to 2021, but the USTA's data points towards an 8% reduction between 2019 and 2022. That's weird. Those numbers are real different. Regardless of possibly inflated economic impact numbers, the tourism industry is pretty significant in Oklahoma's economy. And any downturn, like between 2019 and 2022, could easily be seen as a threat. Only one of Oklahoma's 6 neighboring states also saw a reduction in travel spend during those years. The rest still saw some growth, between 1 and 9%. So if you're Oklahoma, that's not a real comfortable position to find yourself in. And we could probably read the Imagine That rebranding as part of a move to bounce back and hopefully repivot into some growth. And in 2023, the state started a $1.2 million advertising campaign for Imagine That to highlight the top attractions in the state. And on the OTRD's website, we can find the Heavener Runestone Park listed with this written about it. Experience fascinating history and scenic nature at once with a visit to Heavener Runestone Park. This dynamic attraction in southeastern Oklahoma is the site of the annual Heavener Runestone Viking Festival, thanks to its unique history. Opened in 1970, this park is centered on a Swedish-inscribed runestone found in the 1920s. However, according to oral history, the runestone was actually discovered in the 1830s by a Choctaw hunting party. Several ideas have been proposed to explain the origin of the inscriptions. Some claim that the runes document Viking exploration of southeastern Oklahoma in about 1000 AD, while others suggest that the runes were carved in the early 1700s. See the stone for yourself on Poteau Mountain, just outside the town's limits. This branding has a lot going for it. It has mystique, unanswered questions, and is attached to a very strong cultural brand. Vikings are sexy as just look at them. Anyhow, I will get back to that at the end of this video. Maybe more sexy Vikings? I don't know. Stay tuned. But, before all that, we have to talk a bit more about the stone first. The stone itself measures about 12 foot tall by around 10 foot wide and is located in the foothills east of the town of Heavener. On this rock face, there are 8 symbols, which I'll get to in just a minute. But as mentioned earlier, the narrative of the Heavener Runestone's history is brought out from a misty and obscure time into our own written records with the help of an appeal to indigenous oral histories. Now, as the story goes, as the Choctaw entered into the area in the 1830s, a hunting party came across those stones either in 1830, 1832, or 1838. Anyhow, some tellings of this story lead us to believe that the Choctaw considered the stones to be powerful or cursed and avoided them. This story, according to the current narrative, was said to have been passed down orally ever since then until it was shared with non-indigenous researchers who were trying to prove the ancient origins behind these carvings. And that appeal to Native American oral tradition is something to keep in mind for later. But for the story to actually be taken seriously in total, it also needs to have historically verifiable accounts of the runestone. And those show up quite some time later. A man by the name of Ben King testified that his father Wilson and a pair of bear hunters whose names I couldn't find the stone sometime around 1874. And then a man named Luther Capps claimed to have seen the stone when he was a teenager in 1898. But these claims can't actually be verified. Anybody could say anything about what they did or saw when they were younger, as they get older. But if there's nothing substantial to support it, then we can't really rely on their testimony alone. And, sorry, but Scout's honor really isn't good enough here. In the case of Ben King, he wasn't even born yet when he said his father saw the stone, and he was already himself an old man by the time he made the testimonial. So these early claims don't really inspire much confidence. But in 1923, a school teacher by the name of Carl F. Kemmerer wrote to the Smithsonian Institution about the stone and provided them with a sketch to try and learn more about the symbols. So right here is our first historically grounded and verifiable mention of the runestone. About 5 years later, in 1928, Kemmerer took his daughter Rosemary and the then 12-year-old Gloria Farley, who was named Stuart at the time, to go see the stone, which was called Indian Rock at the time, because it was genuinely and generally assumed to be a work of Native American rock art, petroglyphs. But on this hike, Kemmerer told the young girls what the Smithsonian had to say about the sketches that he'd sent. And these were no mere carvings by Native Americans. These symbols on the rock face were identified to him as Norse runes by scholars. And this would change both the life of Gloria Farley and the region's narrative about itself and its own past. It would be through the work of Gloria Farley over the years that not only would Indian Rock become the Heavener Runestone in the 1950s, but also that 55 acres of land surrounding it would come to be donated to the state for a park in 1970. And that Heavener would come to be visited by people from all over the world to see the runestone. The Smithsonian told Kemmerer that the stone had 8 Norse runes carved into it, and that has been the prevailing interpretation of those carvings since that point. Gloria Farley was living in Ohio in the 1940s when she learned about another runestone found near Kensington, Minnesota. This stone brought her back to thinking about the one that she'd known back home in Heavener. And unlike some of the carvings found in the U.S. that have been claimed to be Viking or Norse, these ones actually do seem to have some kind of merits to them. Multiple scholars who study runes, called runologists, have confirmed that the writing is in fact in a runic alphabet. So what do they say? Okay, so here we have our runestone, and here are our runes. Now, most of the characters of this inscription appear to be from the oldest of the runic writing systems called the Elder Futhark, which was used from sometime around 100 to 700 CE by people who spoke the Western Germanic languages. Now, if it is written in this alphabet, then the last of the 8 letters is backwards, which, sometimes happens in runes, so it's not that big of a deal, really. But it's the second letter here that's a bit more controversial, with, some scholarly arguments leading up to fisticuffs. Niche, nerdy fisticuffs, of course. But there are 3 real options here for this letter. Now, first, it could be and was originally identified as an alternate form of the letter A, making the inscription read Gaumedal. Okay, that's fine, except that form of that letter didn't actually exist in the Elder Futhark, but it did in the Norwegian and Swedish variety of the younger Futhark called the Short Twig that went on to replace the Elder Futhark sometime starting around 700 CE. So that one's a bit tricky. It's far more likely that the carver had actually intended to write this, an N. Now, that's actually got something to it. So first off, if it was intended to be the letter N and just kind of carved a bit wonky, then that's not a big issue, and it fits into being still a part of the same alphabet from the same time period, which is probably an important first step. And with that, we have the word nomedal, which can be translated a couple different ways. First, we could split it up as this, dal, which is still the word in Scandinavian languages for the word valley today. And it's the same word in English as dale. And then we have the word gnome, so valley of the gnome. it's pretty adorable. I don't like it anymore. Please take it away. Instead of that word referring to one of those soul-hungry monsters that I will now be seeing in my sleep for the next week, it could be a reference to size or quality. So poor or little valley, don't show me anything. It's also been proposed that it could either be Sundial Valley or Monument Valley, but the linguistics there are pretty sketchy. Now it could also be this, G. Nomedal, a name, which, could possibly account for why that second letter is made somewhat strangely, as some kind of a marker to note a separation, instead of the more typical dots that we often see in runic inscriptions, like you could see here in the Heavener Runestone 2. And there is a family name, Nomedal, which uses two M's today in southern Norway. It's also a name that appears in the 1900 census in Iowa, but not in Oklahoma. In 1986, Dr. Richard Nielsen forwarded a translation, which still seems to be largely accepted at the Runestone Park, that the second letter isn't an A or it isn't an N, but it's actually supposed to be this, an L, so Glomedal, the Valley of Glome, which, yeah, that's a name, just not a very common one. And that would make this stone something else. It would make this stone a land claim, telling everyone who could see who all of the overlooking lands belonged to. And that is something worth keeping in mind for later, too. But still, that interpretation of an L might not be accurate either. While Nelson claimed to have found evidence of the use of two variants of that letter in other inscriptions, that inscription that he was working from was also in the Elder Futhark, which brings us to the same exact problem that we had when it was first identified as being the letter A. Now, one researcher, Alf Monge, a U.S. Army cryptographer, he claimed that the runestone is difficult to translate because, well, it's not a word at all, but a code. In his work, Norse Medieval Cryptography in Runic Carvings, he and his co-author Ole Goverd Landsverk examined a number of runic inscriptions for their capacity to hold coded and often numeric messages inside of them. And in the case of the Heavener Runestone, he claimed that the 8 symbols were, in reality, supposed to reflect a date, the 11th of November of 1012 CE. Exactly what that date is supposed to mean is really up in the air. And this is kind of fun as a thought, that rune inscriptions are also puzzles, but they're fun. But are they true? From 1970 until 2011, the Heavener Runestone was maintained by a state park in public control using public money, as was the fate of a lot of parks, museums, and historic properties. Austerity measures saw its removal from state and into local maintenance, which required a charity to be made to support the site's existence. That organization, the Friends of Heavener Runestone, has this to say about the runestone's origins. Here at the park, we hear all sorts of theories, from it being made by the Irish, the French, Egyptians, to the Ninth Templar. For those with a profession in sorting this type of stuff, the most agreed upon conclusion is that the markings were made between 600 and 800 AD by Vikings, or Scandinavians. Once believed to contain a date, it's now believed the stone was a boundary marker or a land claim. The 8 runes, believed to be from the Elder Futhark, translate best to Gnomedal or Glomedal, which is the little valley or valley owned by Gloma. That's a bit to unpack. It accepts several translations at once and their implications, but most specifically that of the stone being about claiming ownership over land. The friends of the Heavener Runestone, alongside people like Gloria Farley, they consider the runestone to be evidence of a Viking presence in North America. The Friends of Heavener Runestone themselves stated that, those from a profession of sorting this type of stuff, I assume they mean runologists, they say that they agree on the runes being carved sometime between 600 and 800 CE. Except they don't. Okay, so based on the written language alone, we could consider the time range to be that 600 to 800 CE, even with the inconsistencies in the second letter, which in fact Bart Torbert, the president of Gloria Farley Publications, wrote about that in the 2011 issue of Epigraphic Society Occasional Papers. Really sexy title, guys. And he said that it shouldn't be thought of as a problem or as a red flag that there are inconsistencies. It would just had to do with the fact that spelling and the systematic way of writing that we're more familiar with today didn't exist when people were writing in runes. So for him, the inconsistency proves that it was from the early medieval period. However, other scholars have disagreed with the perspectives of people like Farley, Nelson, and Torbert. Actually, one of those differing views was voiced by archaeologist Lyle Thompson in the same exact issue of ESOP. Thompson reminded that not only did scholarly works on runes become widely publicly available in the 1860s, but that Scandinavians who could easily have had some knowledge of runes worked on the railroads and in mines all across Oklahoma. And Heavener was an important stop in that line. Thompson suggested that it was much likelier that the Heavener Runestone was carved by someone between 1866 and 1923, which also happened to coincide with national romantic movements in Scandinavia and Viking revivalisms across the United States. Torbert expressed his frustration that Thompson ignored the testimony of Ben King and the alleged oral histories shared with runestone advocates like Gloria Farley. He then took it a step further by stating that if somebody dismissed the early medieval dates, but then couldn't prove exactly when in the 1800s the runes were carved, then those early dates had to be right. But that's not how that works. Thompson's hypothetical Scandinavian railroad worker isn't provable. Not at all. But it's got fewer gaps to it than it being made by straight-up Vikings. So let's actually take a look at that proposed timeline. Our earliest record of Vikings in English, or Old English rather, come from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle from the year 787. And then we have our more formal beginning of the so-called Viking Age with the raid of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793.
nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Pater Noster qui es in celis, Pater Noster.
And while that might be metal as it's not these people as raiders that we're really interested in right now. It's their image as being great explorers that kind of fits itself into the story of the Heavener Runestone. According to readings of the Landnama book, the Book of Settlements, Scandinavians and settlers from Britain and Ireland arrived to Iceland, which appeared to have already been sparsely occupied by Gaelic monks in the 1870s, sometimes placed at around 874 CE. Several decades later, in the 980s, according to Erik Saga Rauda, or the Saga of Eric the Red, that Scandinavians first began to occupy and colonize Greenland. This same work, along with Grænlendinga Saga, the Saga of the Greenlanders, mentions Scandinavian sailors coming across a few land masses to the west of Greenland around the year 1000, the most significant of those being Vinland. This place, Vinland, is somewhere in North America. Very, very likely the island that we call Newfoundland today. And there's undeniable evidence of a brief period of Scandinavian occupation on that island at a site that we call Lance au Meadow. Now, these sagas that talk about Vinland and Lance au Meadow are often brought up as proof that Vikings were all over the Americas. And don't get me wrong, the people that we call Vikings do have an incredible story of traveling to all sorts of places. You know, we really should take a step back and think this through, though. The biggest problem to Vikings being in Oklahoma, is easily the timeline and the question of distance. To make this a bit easier, let's just imagine a distance between two known Viking settlements, Brattahlid in Greenland and Lance au Meadows in Newfoundland. It's really important to be clear that a straight shot along the Labrador Sea wouldn't actually have been a real option here. Ships during the Viking period didn't actually tend to make very long-range open ocean journeys like that. They preferred to hug along coasts and take shorter trips in open waters. So considering that crossing the Labrador Sea would have been about 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles, well, for reference, that's 3 times longer than the open ocean distance between the Faroe Islands to Iceland, and roughly twice as long as the open ocean journey from Iceland to the coast of Greenland. So this is kind of our most likely route, and that's about 2,750 kilometers. From there, our intrepid voyagers would then need to take a route something like this. Newfoundland to the Mississippi Delta is some 5,646 kilometers. Sailing up the river to get to Heavener then would follow a path something like this, going from the Mississippi Delta up to into its river, then up to the Arkansas River, then to the Plateau, then to Morris Creek, and then finally ending at possibly Dry Creek. That's a really winding journey of another 1,168 kilometers. That is a long trip to take just to carve into a rock and then leave absolutely no other signs of your journey along the way. What would have been the point? Vinland itself was already an incredibly difficult place to get to, which is part of the reason the settlement was quickly abandoned. The other reason?
They dreamt of the riches they would accumulate, the fat-breasted women they would send for. Their dreams changed to bread, roasted meats, even a salad would do.
So, while not technically impossible, this story doesn't add up very well at all. It's even more difficult to piece together when we consider the very evidence that's used to say that the runestone was carved by Vikings. That's the runes themselves. The Elder Futhark stopped being used really before Iceland was colonized, and centuries before Greenland or Vinland were first known or mentioned. So what are we supposed to make of that? That some Scandinavians rode along the Atlantic coast and up the Mississippi River centuries before Scandinavians were actually aware of any of the hopping points that were necessary to make a journey like that possible? And then they get there and decide to claim that land, but not any of the thousands of miles of coast that they'd passed to get there. That's really weird, right? The professor in Scandinavian languages at Uppsala University, Henrik Williams, is one of the best runologists alive today. And he's come to the United States over the years several times to study runestones in the Americas. Several years ago, he arrived at Heavener. He did agree that the stone is absolutely fascinating because it is mysterious and kind of hard to explain. But his professional perspective is that while the runes certainly do look similar to those that could have been found in the 8th century, there's no compelling evidence from any inscriptions that we know of that the way that the runes in the Heavener Runestone were carved could have been found actually from being in that time period. So for him, Gnomes is the only real option for the translation. I guess it's important to bring up those pointy hat-wearing nightmares again. Gnome is a word that wouldn't actually have had any meaning to a medieval Scandinavian. It entered into English and other Germanic languages in the 1700s from an earlier French word. It came from ultimately Latin and then maybe even earlier Greek. And it wasn't actually even really popularized as a word in English until the 1800s when gnomes began to show up in English children's literature. So if that is the right translation for the runestone, then there's really no way that it could have been made before the 1800s. In 2015, Henrik Williams said to an audience at University of Central Oklahoma that it's fascinating because Oklahoma happens to be the place in the United States with the greatest concentration of runestones. So you should be proud of that. But that one thing I can tell you for sure, and I am sorry to say this, but it is not a Viking runestone. Whatever it is not a Viking runestone. This view from a prominent runologist hasn't sat well with people in Heavener, with both the managers of the Heavener Runestone site and members of Heavener's Board of Commerce rejecting the opinions of scholars like Williams and instead preferring their story of Vikings. Now, the truth is that we don't know who carved the Heavener Runestone or why. But, there's no good evidence to say that it was carved earlier than the second half of the 1800s. And there is plenty of evidence to tell us that it wasn't carved earlier than the 1800s. Williams and my preferred translation of the runes is gnomedal. Legends about fairies and magical creatures in the American landscape have been a part of the U.S. storybook since before the United States even existed. And there's something just really fitting about a person in the late 1800s using a mysterious and almost magical style of writing to carve something whimsical and to inject some fantasy into a beautiful area. But the Viking, and especially the land claim angles that seem to be preferred, can't really be summed up just as a scholarly disagreement. Of course, there is a powerful element that the Viking brand brings to tourism. See? I told you they'd come back. And that in itself, this brand, is a social and political use of these stones. But we also have to keep in mind the history of the area. Oklahoma has the most runic inscriptions out of any part of the Americas. And why might that be? Well, settlers began to enter into what is now Oklahoma largely during that period of Viking revival and Romanticism in the United States. And despite being sort of in the middle of what is the United States today, it's actually one of the last territories to become one of the currently 50 states. Because, well, throughout the 1800s, it wasn't Oklahoma. It was known as Indian Territory. Remember that oral history where the stone was first found by a Choctaw hunting party? Now, that story says that they found it in the 1830s. So why not earlier? Well, it was with the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 that the Choctaw were forced to leave their homelands and be relocated into what is today Oklahoma. Thousands dying in this forced march that's commonly called the Trail of Tears. It's in this really grim history that the Heavener Runestone emerges out of its misty and obscure time into our own. In 1890, with the Oklahoma Organic Act, the western portion of what would become Oklahoma was removed from the native people who'd been forced to move there only a few generations earlier. And in 1898, the Curtis Act was passed, which allowed settler communities that were in Indian Territory to place themselves under the laws of the United States rather than those of the native nations whose land it was. This stripped hundreds of thousands of acres of land from the control of indigenous governments. And Heavener was one of those settlements that used the Curtis Act to remove itself from indigenous Choctaw governance. Native governments lost almost all control over their ability to manage land and their own citizens. In 1905, the nations that made up Indian Territory even sought to enter into the United States as a state called Sequoia in order to maintain some form of local indigenous control over the lands. And despite overwhelming local votes in favor of this new state, President Teddy Roosevelt instead signed the Oklahoma Enabling Act, which combined the lands taken in 1890 and the Indian Territory into one place, Oklahoma. And it became the 46th state in 1907. So what does this story boil down to, if not colonization and the dispossession of indigenous peoples of their lands? You know, I strongly doubt that the people of Heavener think of it in those terms, and we couldn't presume that our hypothetical railroad working runesmith had that in mind either. I think to them, you know, Vikings are interesting and cool. Something that if you can celebrate, well then, why not? It doesn't make anyone a bad person for any of that. But strongly holding on to the idea that Vikings traveled an absurdly long distance to come to Oklahoma is not only intellectually indefensible, but it might point towards feelings of ownership. If Vikings actually came and staked their claim to Oklahoma 1,000 years before any of the indigenous people who were forcibly moved there showed up, then isn't it really easy to start to argue that things like the Curtis Act were ethical? I mean, if Europeans claimed it as theirs before the Choctaw were relocated there, then doesn't it mean that it, by right, belongs to Europeans and European settlers? At a 2010 lecture at Northeastern State University in Oklahoma, Henrik Williams said that all runic inscriptions deserve to be inspected by professional runologists, including American ones. This stone, like others, has really, really interesting things to tell us, but we can't get too caught up in the mystique of a story about voyagers from thousands of miles away coming here in distant pasts. If we entertain those stories without overwhelming evidences, then all we're doing is fueling ideas that settler claims to the Americas are much older and then by extension more legitimate than they actually are. And in doing that, then we run into the risk of fostering some sentiment that the violent and genocidal colonization of the Americas was normal, inevitable, or justifiable. Thank you very much for watching this video. You know, there's really so many things to be said on this subject of different people coming to the Americas that I could make videos like this for months. Anyhow, what do you think about things like Vikings or, I don't know, ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, or Israelites coming to the Americas? Just leave me a comment below. And I've also attached a couple links in the description to articles on the Heavener Runestone if you wanted to do some further reading on the subject. Anyhow, if you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and while you're at it, maybe take a look at some of my other videos. I'm Paul Edward, and I'll catch you Archaeofiends next time.